When most people hear the name Salem, their first thought usually goes to the infamous Salem Witch Trials that rocked the fledgling colonial community way back in 1692. But in the centuries since Salem's founding in the early 1600s, this bustling seaside city just 20 miles north of Boston established itself as so much more than the epicenter of colonial American witch hysteria. From its critical role in the American Revolution and early international trade through to its contemporary commercial presence in nearly every house in America, here are 5 fascinating facts you might not know about Salem, Massachusetts. Number 1. Always ready, always there. While the Salem Witch Hysteria might be the most well-known event to ever take place in this small New England city, it certainly wasn't the first that would go on to have a major impact on American history. Salem was first settled by a small group of English colonial fishermen in 1626, and over the next 3 years, hundreds of additional settlers arrived in what would become the first permanent colony founded by the Massachusetts Bay Company. It quickly became clear to the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that their rapidly growing community required some form of organized protection to combat whatever outside forces might seek to disrupt their great Puritan experiment. In 1637, the General Court of the Mass Bay Colony passed a resolution to create a centralized colonial militia that would operate 3 well-regulated regiments made up of the community's able-bodied men. In the spring of that year, the East Regiment held their first muster on Salem City Common and laid the groundwork for what we now know as the Army National Guard. In 2013, President Barack Obama signed a bill into federal law formally acknowledging Salem as the birthplace of the National Guard. Every year, thousands of servicemen and women gather at this very spot on Salem Common where the East Regiment held their first muster and commemorate the Guard's origins with a 21-gun salute. Number 2. Divine Providence? If your city is known around the world for trying hundreds of innocent people on accusations of witchcraft, saying your founding fathers were a little overreactive about all things religion might be a bit of an understatement. And this was true even before the Salem Witch Trials. Salem's early leaders were Puritans, English Protestant settlers who left for the New World because they were dissatisfied with the Church of England. These were individuals whose faith and piety was intertwined with everything they did, and the new Mass Bay Colony would serve as a haven for them to practice their extremely conservative religious way of life without disruption from the English crown. But at this stage in the history of Puritan America, not all settlers were on the same page about how their Puritanism should play out in the New World. In 1634, a fiery young Puritan preacher by the name of Roger Williams became the acting head pastor of the First Church of Salem. Williams was liked by the Puritan residents of Salem, but his welcome soon wore out with the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They viewed his passionate writings against the English crown and accusations of illegal colonial land grabs from Native American tribes as detrimental to the colony's success. In 1635, just a year after his arrival in Salem, the General Court charged Williams of heresy and sedition and banished him from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Williams packed up his belongings and headed south with a small band of followers from Salem, eventually forming a new settlement along the Providence River. Their new community, the Providence Plantations, would eventually become the state of Rhode Island. Today, Roger Williams' legacy as the founder of Rhode Island is memorialized throughout the state with numerous schools, parks, and hospitals named after the Puritan leader. If Roger Williams had never been exiled from his home in Salem, America's smallest state might look a whole lot different than it does today. Number 3. Dodging a bullet, heard around the world. Some 80 years after the events of the Salem Witch Trials, the American colonists in Salem had settled down a bit. The Puritan grip on the community had dissolved, Massachusetts was a unified English colony, and the citizens of Salem spent their days engaged in the trades of fishing and shipping out of the city's bustling harbor. But by the 1770s, the people of Salem, along with many of their fellow colonists up and down the east coast of North America, had rallied around a new enemy, the English crown. After decades of crushing taxation without representation from a government an ocean away, the 13 colonies were at their breaking point and were openly defying British rule through mass protests and revolts. In 1775, the English government declared the colony of Massachusetts to be in an open state of rebellion and sent the might of the British military to intervene. A full-fledged war could break out any minute, and it very nearly did one cold February afternoon in Salem. On Sunday, February 26th, an entire British infantry regiment stationed in Boston landed just south of the city in Marblehead, Massachusetts, with orders to find stores of guns and ammunition hidden in Salem by the colonial militia. Tipped off by sympathetic residents of Marblehead, the Patriots of Salem quickly spread the news of the British troops marching on their city and set to work. Salemites ripped up a bridge crossing into town and rallied just over the North River where the critical cache of munitions was stored. By the time the British forces arrived in the city, the North River drawbridge had been raised and several of the river barges had been intentionally sunk to prevent them from being used in a crossing. The British lieutenant colonel leading the regiment, Alexander Leslie, was understandably furious. The armed patriots across the river yelled to the British troops to take the guns if you can, they will not be surrendered. The stalemate continued for hours, and all the while the patriots of Salem were busy moving their precious cannons off to a safe location away from the prying hands of the British troops. As dusk approached, it was Lieutenant Colonel Leslie that broke first, claiming that his only orders were to cross the river and that as soon as he had done so, he would take his men back to Boston. The patriots cautiously agreed, lowered the drawbridge, and watched on with their muskets at the ready as the redcoats crossed, wheeled around, and headed for home. In this very first armed encounter between Massachusetts colonial militiamen and British regulars, cooler heads prevailed and no blood was spilled on Salem ground. Though just 2 short months later, the opening volleys of the American Revolution would be heard some 20 miles to the west at Lexington and Concord, and the colony's fight for freedom would officially begin. Had Salem's quick-thinking militiamen not pulled off their clever stunt to keep Colonel Leslie's redcoats at bay, the American Revolution might very well have started right here in Salem, Massachusetts. Number 4. Who wants to be a millionaire? Though the patriot militiamen of Salem may not have fired the first shots of the Revolutionary War, they certainly took part in their fair share of the fighting. As the war broke out in 1775, it was clear to America's founding fathers that they would have to overcome a serious manpower disadvantage to the British. And perhaps the most glaring weakness of the budding American military was its ability to counter the impressive British Navy. But George Washington and his generals knew one thing there was no shortage of in colonial Massachusetts: angry fishermen and merchant sailors who would like nothing more than to see the British fleet out of their waters. The Continental Congress quickly started to issue letters of marque to any willing and able ship captains, granting them official permission to commit piracy on the open seas. These government-sanctioned privateers were allowed to use any means at their disposal to capture and destroy as many ships flying the British flag as they could. And if removing redcoats from the colony wasn't enough motivation, the privateers were allowed to keep and sell whatever goods, gold, and ships they captured from the crown. Almost overnight, Salem's bustling seaport became a hub for revolutionary piracy, with nearly 800 ships sailing in and out of the city hunting on behalf of the patriot cause. Salem's privateering boom not only helped the revolutionaries destroy and capture over 600 British ships, but it made many Salem ship captains very, very wealthy men. And perhaps no man was more successful than one Elias Haskett Derby. By the time the war broke out in 1775, Derby was already a successful businessman in Salem with over a dozen ships engaged in trading throughout the Atlantic. But Derby's real success came when he decided to arm his merchant fleet and send them off hunting British ships. As the war raged on, Derby's privateers proved to be some of the best, and Derby grew more and more wealthy. He invested a huge sum in building a state-of-the-art flagship for his pirate fleet that he christened the Grand Turk. Bristling with cannons and wrapped with a glistening copper hull, the Grand Turk alone was able to defeat more than 25 British vessels before war's end. When the dust settled on the Revolution following America's victory at Yorktown, Elias Haskett Derby found himself with some of America's biggest and best ships floating in Salem Harbor with nothing to do. So he turned back to what he knew best: business. Derby sent his ships out to trade with Europe, India, Russia, Japan, and Australia, and brought back some of the finest luxury goods, rum, and spices to sell in America. The Grand Turk, now converted to a massive trading vessel, became the very first New England ship to reach the faraway ports of China. By the 1790s, Elias Haskett Derby's international spice trading fleet had made him America's very first millionaire. And he wasn't alone in his success. Salem was world-renowned as a trading hub, and for a time was the wealthiest per capita city in the entire newly formed United States. The legacy of Elias Haskett Derby and Salem's trading boom lives on today. In fact, there's a good chance you might have a picture of Derby's Grand Turk in your home right now. The ship on every container of Old Spice grooming products? That's Elias Haskett Derby's Grand Turk. Before we move on to our last fascinating fact about Salem, Massachusetts, why not plan a trip to come visit Salem yourself? Book a guided tour with one of Witch City Walking Tour's talented and passionate guides for an up-close and personal look at the history and mysteries of Salem, Massachusetts. Voted the #1 cultural and historical tour in the United States by TripAdvisor, start your Salem vacation off right with one of our year-round daily tours. Learn more and save when you book directly through witchcitywalkingtours.com today. Number 5, a monopoly on family game night. While Elias Haskett Derby might have been Salem's very first millionaire, he certainly wouldn't be the last. By the early 19th century, Salem's seemingly unstoppable trading boom had finally begun to die down as technology advanced and the trading ships of the day became too large to sail into Salem's once crowded harbor. Salem's future now lied in manufacturing, with factories popping up all over the city producing leather goods, shoes, cotton, and more, much of which supported Union forces during the American Civil War. In 1883, a young Salem man by the name of George Parker made his first venture into the world of business, not selling shoes or clothing like many of the other businesses in town, but by selling games. His first game, called Banking, was a simple but clever card game that encouraged players to explore the thrilling themes of borrowing and wealth management. Parker's friends in Salem loved it, but the big game manufacturers in Boston thought it was a dud. Never one to be discouraged, Parker financed and released 500 copies of the game himself, turning a large profit for the time of $100. With help from his two brothers, George Parker founded the Salem-based Parker Brothers Game Company in 1883 and went on to release dozens of hit games known the world over. In 1906, the Parker Brothers game Rook became the top-selling game in the entire United States. In the 1930s, times were particularly rough for the average American worker. The Great Depression was in full force and millions were out of work. The Parker brothers, seeing the public's growing distrust of big business and the shortcomings of a capitalist society, released a new game that played into these very themes. Monopoly hit stores across the country in 1935 and became an overnight success. The Parker brothers would go on to release other hits like Clue, Sorry, Risk, Ouija, and many more beloved board games. Salem's own George Parker died in 1952, but his legacy lives on in living rooms and at kitchen tables across America every time someone cracks open a Parker Brothers box for family game night. So, did you know these 5 fascinating facts about Salem, Massachusetts? Subscribe right here to Witch City Walking Tours to learn more about Salem's history, hauntings, and mysteries, and start planning your visit to Salem today at witchcitywalkingtours.com.